General Hospital will reveal Lulu carried within her a fracture that had never truly healed, a silent, ever-present wound carved deeply into her identity by a childhood marked not by warmth and safety, but by abandonment and emotional desolation. She had been born into a family revered and infamous in equal measure, one of legacy, power, and mythos, yet behind the grandeur was a chasm of dysfunction. Her father, idolized by Port Charles, was emotionally distant, a legend who never quite knew how to be a father. Her mother, once the symbol of romantic tragedy, had battled psychological trauma that rendered her unable to offer Lulu the consistent, nurturing presence she so desperately needed. Her formative years were a blur of caretakers and complications, of being passed off, of having her voice silenced amid the larger-than-life dramas of Luke, Laura, Helena, and the Cassidines. Through her adolescence and into adulthood, Lulu experienced a devastating pattern of loss, especially when it came to motherhood. She had been robbed not once, but multiple times, first through her own difficult decision to terminate a pregnancy, then through the horrifying realization that Helena had stolen her embryo to create Charlotte, and later when Britt deceitfully carried her and Dante's child and passed him off as her own. Time and again, she had watched her right to mother her children stripped away by forces far beyond her control. She spent years in a coma, robbed of even the ability to be present as her children grew. These traumas congealed into a bitterness that was never fully extinguished, a reservoir of grief that shaped her worldview and quietly poisoned her sense of self-worth. So when Lulu discovered that Gio, the charismatic, talented, soulful young man who had recently emerged in their orbit, was in fact the biological son of Dante and Brook, something inside her cracked. It wasn't merely the shock of the revelation. It was the way it placed her outside of a narrative she had always seen herself at the center of. She had imagined herself and Dante as a unit, even after their relationship had ended. In her mind, there had always been a thread binding them, something unbreakable forged through love, loss, and shared history. But this changed everything. Gio wasn't just a child, he was the living embodiment of a secret bond between Dante and Brook, one that predated Lulu's deepest traumas, one that had been hidden from them all, but that now threatened to overwrite everything Lulu had left. Brook, who Lulu had always viewed as impulsive, privileged, and undeserving of the empathy she so freely received, suddenly became a threat. It wasn't just jealousy, it was a primal fear of being replaced. Brook, had something Lulu never truly did, a child with Dante, a connection that not even time or distance could sever. And worse, she had managed to keep it secret. For years, while Lulu grieved the children she never got to raise, Brook, had been carrying the burden of a truth that, when revealed, could detonate lives. Lulu saw it as hypocrisy. She saw it as betrayal. And in that volatile mix of envy, rage, and wounded pride, she made a decision. When she overheard whispers about a child Brook, had once given up, something cloaked in the shame and secrecy of youth, tied to the name Lois and buried in years of silence, Lulu didn't need a full investigation. The dots aligned themselves in her mind like puzzle pieces that had always been there, just waiting for someone bitter enough to see the picture they formed. She seized the knowledge not with empathy, but with purpose. She painted herself as a truth-teller, a heroine in Joe's story, someone brave enough to give him what had been denied all his life. She told herself it was for his benefit, for Dante's right to know. But beneath that facade was a festering resentment so consuming that it had transformed into cruelty. Lulu didn't consider the emotional shrapnel her revelation would unleash. She didn't weigh the cost of truth delivered too soon, too brutally. She only saw a chance to destroy the illusion of peace Brook, had crafted, to ruin whatever fragile understanding existed between her and Dante, and to destabilize a family she believed should have never been allowed to exist without her at the center. But she gravely underestimated Gio. What she had viewed as a strategic chess piece was, in reality, a young man already grappling with his own identity, his place in a world that often felt hostile and confusing. Gio had grown up believing one truth about himself, one version of love and family. To have that torn away, not gently, not thoughtfully, but as part of someone else's vendetta, was not just shocking. It was soul-shattering. The person he had trusted, who had seemed like a friend, a safe presence, had used his deepest vulnerabilities as ammunition in a war he didn't even know was being fought. Lulu's revelation didn't enlighten him, it annihilated him. In an instant, he lost his sense of belonging, of trust, of certainty. And he was left not just confused or hurt, but profoundly broken in a way that might never fully heal. What made it worse, what turned confusion into devastation, was learning that Dante had never known. That the man he had unknowingly crossed paths with, spoken to, maybe even looked up to, was his father, and neither of them had been granted the grace of discovering that truth in a moment of warmth or intention. It had been forced upon them like a knife in the dark. Brook hadn't been given the chance to explain, to prepare her son or the father of her child for the emotional avalanche that was coming. Instead, Lulu had ripped the curtain away, exposing them all, not for healing, but for chaos. Dante was blindsided. The news hit him like a freight train, dismantling whatever emotional stability he had painstakingly rebuilt after years of loss and guilt. To learn that he had a son, not through a moment of reconnection or redemption, but through a calculated betrayal by someone he had once loved, shattered his trust. He looked at Lulu not with confusion, but with something far more permanent, disappointment. Disgust. The understanding that she had chosen vengeance over compassion, that she had wielded the truth like a weapon with no regard for the lives she would splinter. Whatever bond had existed between them dissolved in that moment, as Dante made the only decision he could, to walk away. Not just from Lulu, but from the toxicity she had allowed to define her actions. Gio, now caught in a storm he never asked for, became the unwilling link between two people who could no longer look at each other without seeing regret. His identity crisis deepened, not because of who he was, but because of how that truth had been weaponized. He struggled with the idea that he was a product of secrecy, that his existence had been erased and denied until it became convenient for someone else's narrative. He wasn't just hurting. He was unraveling, and no one, not even Dante or Brook, could immediately fix what had been broken. And the tragic irony was that in trying to destroy Brook, Lulu had also destroyed any possibility of reclaiming a meaningful place in Joe's life. He couldn't forgive her. Not yet. Maybe not ever. As for Lulu, she stood alone, watching the wreckage she had created, perhaps expecting some vindication, some satisfaction that never came. Because the truth, once weaponized, doesn't heal. It devastates. She had believed, perhaps naively, that exposing the truth would return her to relevance, would restore her as a central figure in Dante's life. Instead, it had made her a pariah. And for the first time, Lulu was forced to reckon not just with the pain of her past, but with the consequences of using that pain to inflict new ones. She had become the very force of destruction she had always blamed others for being. And in doing so, she had lost the only thing she truly wanted, belonging. Dante stood frozen in the wake of the revelation, emotionally gutted, unable to comprehend how Lulu, once the woman he had loved with the fiercest parts of his soul, could have orchestrated something so cruel and destructive. It wasn't simply the truth that shattered him, but the manner in which it had been unraveled, so recklessly, so publicly, and with no regard for the people it would destroy. He had always believed Lulu's heart, though battle-scarred and worn by years of trauma, remained rooted in empathy. But now, that belief crumbled. Her betrayal wasn't just of him. It was of their shared humanity, their history, their unspoken understanding that no matter how broken they had become, they would never purposefully hurt the innocent. Yet, in weaponizing Joe's very existence, she had hurt the one person who mattered most. The distance between Dante and Brook, already marked by awkward silences and years of unresolved emotion, instantly became a chasm. They had once shared a brief but passionate past, full of impulsive choices and adolescent love, but life had pulled them in separate directions. The idea that they had a child, conceived in secret, lost to time, and returned now in the form of a broken, bewildered teenager, was almost too much to grasp. Neither of them knew how to process the reality, let alone how to respond to it. Should they collapse into each other and mourn what was lost, or should they retreat, each nursing their own guilt? Brook stood paralyzed, her voice trembling as Gio, with eyes brimming with fury and heartbreak, called her the woman who abandoned him. That single phrase, "the one who threw me away," echoed through the room like a gunshot. And Dante, watching them both, felt something deep within him rupture. He had been thrown into the center of a storm that had been building for years, oblivious to its formation, and now forced to confront the wreckage it left behind. Lois, too, could no longer hide behind the veil of good intentions. Years ago, when she made the decision to take Brook's newborn away and place him for adoption, she believed she was doing the right thing. Her daughter had been a teenager, overwhelmed, frightened, and unprepared. Lois had wanted to shield her, to give her the freedom to grow without the chains of a premature motherhood. But now, standing amidst the wreckage of a family imploding, Lois realized that the choices made to protect had instead created a legacy of pain. The silence she had maintained all these years, the refusal to confess, the insistence that it was all for the best, had planted seeds of resentment and confusion that were now blooming into full-fledged devastation. The decisions made in secrecy had become intergenerational scars, passed down through silence and shame, finally breaking open with Gio as the unintended casualty. Lulu, in the darkest irony, had achieved what she set out to do. She had ripped the illusion of peace to shreds. She had made Brook suffer, she had driven a wedge between Dante and the fragile progress he had made in moving forward, and she had forced the truth into the light. But the victory was hollow, poisoned by the fact that in doing so, she had forever shattered the last pieces of trust Dante had placed in her. He could not look at her without seeing the pain Gio was now carrying, without feeling the weight of betrayal not just as a man, but as a father. There was no redemption in her actions, only cruelty masquerading as honesty. The woman he once would have sacrificed anything for was now unrecognizable to him. And so he left her, not out of anger, but out of sheer devastation. He walked away carrying the remnants of a heart that could no longer bear the burden of forgiveness. Meanwhile, Gio, standing at the center of a war he never asked to be part of, became the embodiment of the collision between love and betrayal, between truth and the cruel ways it can be used. All his life, others had made choices for him, crafted narratives around him, denied him the right to understand who he was on his own terms. And now, those same people looked to him for grace, for understanding, for forgiveness they had not earned. The adults around him spoke in broken apologies, in fragmented justifications, in words that offered no real comfort. But Gio had no language for the grief he was drowning in. How could he forgive when he hadn't yet made sense of the pain? How could he trust when every truth he had ever known had been shattered by the very people who claimed to care for him? Still, in the midst of that chaos, Joe's presence became an anchor, an unavoidable truth that forced Brook and Dante to face each other after years of avoidance and bitterness. They could no longer afford the luxury of denial. No longer could they lean on the distance of time or the weight of their own guilt to keep them apart. Gio needed them, not as strangers bound by a shared mistake, but as parents who had to rise above shame and regret. Pride had to be abandoned. Old wounds had to be confronted. Because if they were to salvage anything, if not for themselves, then for Gio, they had to show up, fully and honestly, for the son who had been forgotten for far too long. And so, amidst the ruins of secrets and broken ties, Gio became something unexpected. Not just the victim of decades of poor choices, but the catalyst for something new. A reckoning. A rebirth. He was no longer the boy who had been given away, he was now the force that demanded accountability, that summoned change. Brook, humbled and shaken, knew she had to earn his love, not assume it. Dante, heartbroken but determined, recognized that fatherhood wasn't about the years lost, but the commitment forged in the now. Together, they stepped into the unknown, tethered by a shared duty to a boy who had lost everything, but who might, just might, still be the reason they found themselves again. And Lulu, standing alone, was left with the bitter taste of consequences. She had tried to destroy Brook Lynn's peace, but in the process, she had destroyed herself. Her name, once spoken with fondness by Dante, was now burdened with disappointment. Her face, once a source of comfort to Gio, was now a trigger for pain. She had won the battle for truth, but lost the war for love. And in the silence that followed, she finally understood, the truth, when told without compassion, is not liberation, it is destruction. And as for Lulu, in the end, she stood alone in the silence of a cold, empty house, surrounded not by the vindication she had hoped for, but by the echoing consequences of her own destruction. The victory she once believed she had secured. Uncovering the truth, exposing secrets, forcing Dante and Brook Lynn to confront what had been buried, now hung in the air like a bitter draught, offering no comfort, no warmth, and certainly no sense of peace. She had imagined, perhaps naively, that bringing the truth to light would make her feel powerful, would restore some semblance of control over the chaos that had defined her life. But instead, she found herself imprisoned in a victory that felt more like a sentence than a reward. Dante was gone, not just physically, but in the irrevocable way someone disappears when their trust has been shattered beyond repair. He no longer looked at her with the tenderness of shared memories or the hope of reconciliation. His eyes, when they met hers that final time, were not filled with rage or hatred, they were simply void. And in some ways, that emptiness hurt more than any fury ever could. It meant he no longer saw her as a part of his life, no longer felt her absence as a wound. She had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, and now she stood on the other side of it, watching the person she loved most rebuild his world without her. Gio, too, had vanished from her reach. He had once smiled at her, trusted her, looked to her as a guiding figure in his chaotic world. But now his gaze held only betrayal. He didn't raise his voice, didn't curse her, didn't scream at her for taking away his sense of security and identity. His silence was louder than any accusation. It was the kind of silence that settled into her bones, that haunted her long after the doors closed and the lights went out. She had meant to give him the truth, but what she delivered instead was devastation, the kind that doesn't mend with apologies or time. And she knew, deep down, that there was no repairing what had been broken between them. Not because he was incapable of forgiveness, but because she had not earned it. Her name, once spoken with affection by those around her, now stirred unease. Friends avoided her calls. Family gave her space, too much space. She became the woman who had tried to right a wrong by committing another, the woman who used pain as leverage, who let jealousy and fear masquerade as moral obligation. She had stood at a moral crossroad and chosen vengeance, cloaking it in the language of truth. But the truth, she now understood, is only healing when it's wielded with love. Used carelessly, it becomes a blade that cuts too deep to heal. She wandered through the house in the stillness of early morning, where no footsteps echoed, no voices lingered, no laughter remained. Every room held a memory of what she had lost, not to time or chance, but to the choices she had made. The kitchen still smelled faintly of cinnamon from mornings when she and Dante would rush to make breakfast together. The hallway mirror still reflected the image of a woman who no longer recognized herself. The family photographs, once proudly displayed, now sat turned face down in drawers she couldn't bring herself to open. And in the living room, where she once believed a future could be rebuilt, there was now only dust and the heavy breath of remorse. The truth of it all settled in like winter, slow, unrelenting, and bitter. She had fought so hard to protect her own wounds, to guard her heart from ever being forgotten, overlooked, or discarded, that she had become blind to the damage she was inflicting in the process. Her pain had become her compass, her rage the wind in her sails. But what she never realized was that pain, when left unchecked, does not guide, it consumes. And in her desperate attempt to assert control over a life that had repeatedly spun out of her hands, she had unknowingly tightened her grip around the throats of those she loved, choking out what little compassion still remained. She had told herself that her actions were necessary, that Dante needed to know, that Gio deserved the truth. But standing there in the aftermath, there was no denying the truth she had never dared to speak. She had done it not for them, but for herself. To be seen. To be relevant. To matter. And now, with everyone gone, she finally understood the cost of needing to matter at the expense of someone else's peace. Outside, the world moved on. Spring began to unfurl its early light, children walked to school, cafes opened their doors, lovers held hands unaware of the private tragedies unfolding behind quiet windows. But inside Lulu's house, time had stopped. There were no footsteps returning, no doors opening, no forgiveness coming. All that remained was the echo of her own breath, the relentless beat of guilt in her chest, and the crushing realization that in trying to protect her own brokenness, she had only deepened it. She was alone now, not by fate, not by circumstance, but by choice. Her own. And that was the hardest truth of all.